Silence. That is what struck the first responders most. Not the heat. Not the radiation. The silence of a reactor that should have been roaring, now open to the night sky, its core exposed, pouring invisible death into the air above a sleeping city. It was 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986. And the world had just changed forever. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Unit 4, had just experienced the worst nuclear accident in the history of human civilization. An explosion so powerful it blew the 1,000-ton reactor lid clean off its housing. A fire so intense it burned for 10 days. A release of radioactive material 400 times greater than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. But here is what the Soviet Union did not want you to know. They knew it was catastrophic within hours. And for days, critical, irreplaceable days, they told the world almost nothing. Stay with us. Because the full story of Chernobyl is not just the story of an explosion. It is the story of what happens when governments lie, and ordinary people pay the price with their lives. Subscribe to Silent Epoch Vault. The stories we tell here are the ones power tried to silence. The night everything went wrong. To understand what happened at Chernobyl on the night of April 25 to 26, 1986, you need to understand what the engineers were trying to do, and why everything they did made the situation catastrophically worse. The Soviet RBMK reactor, the type used at Chernobyl, was a design unique to the Soviet Union. Unlike Western reactor designs, the RBMK used graphite as a moderator and water as a coolant. This combination created a dangerous physical property known as a positive void coefficient, meaning that as the cooling water heated up and turned to steam, the nuclear reaction actually accelerated rather than slowing down. Western nuclear engineers knew this was a dangerous design flaw. Soviet engineers knew it too. But the RBMK was cheaper and faster to build than safer alternatives, and the Soviet nuclear program needed reactors quickly. The flaw was documented in classified internal reports, and then deliberately suppressed. The operators at Chernobyl Unit 4 on the night of April 25 were conducting a safety test. The test was designed to determine whether, in the event of a power failure, the turbines spinning down could generate enough electricity to power the emergency cooling pumps for the 60 to 75 seconds it would take for backup diesel generators to come online. It was a legitimate safety concern. The test had been attempted 3 times before, and failed each time. Tonight was the 4th attempt. From the beginning, nothing went right. The test had originally been scheduled for the day shift, when the most experienced operators would be on duty. Political pressure from the Ukrainian grid controller delayed it by nearly 10 hours, pushing it into the night shift, staffed by operators who had not been briefed on the test procedure. At around 11:04 p.m. on April 25, reactor power was reduced in preparation for the test. It fell too far, dropping to near zero in what operators called a xenon pit, a condition where a buildup of radioactive xenon gas suppresses the nuclear reaction. Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer supervising the test, ordered operators to raise power again. This violated established safety protocols. The reactor was unstable. It should have been shut down. Instead, the operators withdrew almost all of the control rods from the reactor core, far beyond what safety regulations permitted, in an attempt to raise power quickly. The reactor became critically unstable, running at a fraction of its designed power level. Its core filled with xenon. Its control systems compromised. A ticking device of extraordinary destructive potential. And then they ran the test anyway. At 1:23:04 a.m. on April 26, the test began. The turbine was disconnected from the steam supply. Water flow through the reactor decreased. Steam voids formed in the cooling channels. The positive void coefficient kicked in. Power began to surge. At 1:23:40 a.m., a reactor operator triggered an emergency shutdown, inserting all control rods simultaneously. But the RBMK reactor had another fatal design flaw. The control rods had graphite tips. When they entered the reactor, the graphite tips momentarily increased reactivity before the neutron-absorbing sections could take effect. The power surge was instantaneous and catastrophic. In approximately 3 seconds, reactor power spiked to an estimated 30,000 megawatts, 10 times its maximum designed output. The fuel fragmented. Steam pressure exploded. At 1:23:58 a.m., 2 massive explosions tore through the reactor building. The first blew apart the cooling circuit. The second, possibly a nuclear excursion, though this remains debated, blew the 1,000-ton reactor lid off completely, opened the reactor core to the sky, and hurled burning chunks of reactor graphite and nuclear fuel across the surrounding grounds. Chernobyl Unit 4 no longer existed as a functioning reactor. It was an open nuclear wound in the surface of the Earth, pouring radiation into the atmosphere at levels that instruments on site could not even measure, because no instrument had been built to measure what was now happening. The lies that cost lives. Within minutes of the explosion, plant management was receiving reports from the site. The initial assessments were almost uniformly incorrect, not through honest error, but through a combination of ideological pressure, institutional denial, and instruments that had gone off-scale. When dosimeters capable of measuring lethal radiation levels were sent to the site, many were found locked in a safe because they had not been needed before and nobody had the key. The dosimeters that were available had a maximum reading of 3.6 Röntgen per hour. Many of them pegged immediately at their maximum reading. Plant management reported 3.6 Röntgen per hour to Moscow. This figure, the maximum their available instruments could display, became the official reading. What it actually represented was simply the upper limit of the instruments available, not the true radiation level, which was orders of magnitude higher. When workers and firefighters arrived at the scene of the explosion, they saw chunks of shiny black material scattered across the grounds. Some of them picked these chunks up. They were pieces of reactor graphite, intensely radioactive. Some of the men who touched these pieces died within weeks. Nobody told them what they were handling. Nobody warned them what the exposure meant. Plant director Viktor Brukhanov sent a telex to Moscow at 5 a.m. reporting that the situation was under control. That radiation levels were at 3.6 Röntgen per hour. That there had been a partial destruction of the reactor building, but the reactor itself was intact. None of this was true. The reactor was destroyed. Radiation levels in some areas exceeded 15,000 Röntgen per hour, a dose lethal to an unprotected human being within minutes. And the reactor core was burning, releasing radioactive material continuously into the atmosphere above a sleeping city of 50,000 people. The city of Pripyat, built specifically to house workers of the Chernobyl plant, sitting less than 3 kilometers from the reactor, was not evacuated that night. Or the next morning. Pripyat's 49,000 residents went about their Saturday morning. Children played outside. The outdoor market opened. A wedding was celebrated in the city center. All of them were breathing radioactive air. The evacuation of Pripyat did not begin until 36 hours after the explosion, at 2 p.m. on April 27th. Residents were told to take only essentials. They were told it was temporary. They were told they would return in 3 days. They never returned. The Liquidators. In the days, weeks, and months that followed the explosion, the Soviet Union mobilized one of the largest emergency response operations in human history. They called them the Liquidators. Over the course of the Chernobyl cleanup operation, which lasted from 1986 to approximately 1990, An estimated 600,000 people were sent to work in and around the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Soldiers, miners, construction workers, scientists, helicopter pilots, firefighters, engineers. Many of them were not told the truth about what they were being exposed to. The helicopter pilots who flew over the open reactor core, dropping sand, lead, boron, and dolomite in an attempt to smother the graphite fire, flew mission after mission through radioactive smoke. Some flew dozens of missions. Their radiation exposure records were falsified, capped at levels that would not trigger mandatory reassignment, because the operation needed pilots. The miners who were brought in to dig a tunnel beneath the reactor, to prevent the molten core from potentially melting through the concrete foundation and reaching the groundwater, worked in temperatures exceeding 50 degrees Celsius, with almost no protective equipment. They worked in shifts, racing against time, in conditions of extreme radiation exposure. The so-called biorobots, soldiers and workers who were sent to the roof of the damaged reactor building to manually shovel radioactive graphite over the edge, were given lead aprons, lead plates sewn into their underwear, respirators, and a maximum exposure time of 90 seconds per person. After 90 seconds on the roof, their allowed radiation dose for the entire cleanup operation was considered exhausted. 90 seconds per person. Because 90 seconds was all the human body could withstand in that environment. The true-scale human cost of the Liquidator operation remains one of the most contested and politically sensitive questions in the entire Chernobyl story. Official Soviet, and later Russian and Ukrainian, figures have consistently placed the number of deaths directly attributable to Chernobyl radiation at a few dozen, primarily the 28 emergency workers who died of acute radiation syndrome in the weeks immediately following the explosion. Independent research tells a very different story. Studies published in peer-reviewed journals have estimated that the long-term cancer deaths attributable to Chernobyl radiation, across Europe and the former Soviet Union, may number in the tens of thousands. Some researchers put the figure higher. The full epidemiological picture is complicated by the deliberate suppression of medical data by Soviet authorities, the long latency period of radiation-induced cancers, and the political pressure that has consistently pushed official estimates downward. What is not disputed is this. The people who went to Chernobyl to protect the rest of the world paid an incalculable price. Many of them knew the risks. Many of them went anyway. Many of them died, or suffered the consequences for the rest of their lives, largely in silence. The story you are hearing right now has been suppressed, minimized, and misrepresented for decades. If it matters to you, subscribe to Silent Epoch Vault and hit the like button. We read every comment. The Exclusion Zone. On May 2, 1986, Soviet authorities established a 30-kilometer exclusion zone around the Chernobyl plant. All remaining residents within this zone, approximately 116,000 people from the surrounding towns and villages, were evacuated. They left behind everything. Houses, furniture, photographs, livestock, gardens. The accumulated possessions of lifetimes, abandoned in place, because the radiation contamination made them impossible to take and dangerous to keep. The town of Pripyat became the most famous ghost city in the world. Its apartment blocks, its schools, its hospital, its fairground, the Ferris wheel that had been scheduled to open on May 1st, just 5 days after the explosion, and never did, all standing empty. Frozen in time at the moment of evacuation. In the decades since, nature has reclaimed much of what humans abandoned. Forests have grown through buildings. Animals have returned, wolves, lynx, wild horses, bears, flourishing in the absence of human activity despite the residual radiation. Scientists studying wildlife in the exclusion zone have produced some of the most surprising ecological data of the late 20th century. Some species appear to be thriving. Others show genetic damage consistent with radiation exposure. The long-term ecological consequences of the Chernobyl exclusion zone remain an active area of scientific research. But for the 350,000 people who were permanently displaced, who lost their homes, their communities, their way of life, the exclusion zone is not a nature preserve or a scientific curiosity. It is the grave of everything they once had. The sarcophagus and the new safe confinement. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, Soviet engineers faced a problem of almost incomprehensible scale. How do you contain an open nuclear reactor that is still burning? The solution they developed, hastily, under extreme time pressure, with workers who could only spend minutes at a time in the most contaminated areas, was the object shelter, informally known as the sarcophagus. Constructed between June and November 1986, the sarcophagus was a massive concrete and steel structure built around the destroyed reactor building. It was not designed to last forever. It was designed to last 30 years, long enough for a more permanent solution to be developed. It was built under impossible conditions, by workers who could not remain in the construction area long enough to follow normal building procedures. The quality of the construction reflected these conditions. By the 1990s, cracks were appearing in the structure. By the 2000s, there were genuine fears that it could collapse, releasing a new cloud of radioactive dust into the atmosphere. The permanent solution, the new safe confinement, was a project of international scale. Designed by a French consortium, funded by 45 nations, and constructed over more than a decade, the new safe confinement is the largest movable land structure ever built. A steel arch 108 meters high, 257 meters wide, and 162 meters long, built beside the old sarcophagus and then slid into position over it on rails in November 2016. The new safe confinement is designed to last 100 years. It is equipped with remote-controlled cranes that will eventually be used to dismantle the destroyed reactor from the inside. It contains its own ventilation system, its own drainage, its own monitoring equipment. It cost approximately 1.5 billion euros. For a disaster that the Soviet Union initially reported as a minor accident. The truth the Soviet Union buried. The full extent of what the Soviet government knew, and when they knew it, has only become clear in the decades since the fall of the USSR, as classified documents have been declassified and former officials have spoken. What the documents show is damning. The RBMK reactor's positive void coefficient flaw, the design characteristic that made the April 26 accident possible, had been identified in classified internal documents as early as 1983. 3 years before Chernobyl. Those documents were classified. The operators at Chernobyl Unit 4 had never been told about this critical flaw in the reactor they were operating. When the explosion occurred, the Soviet leadership's primary concern in the first 24 hours was not the safety of Pripyat's residents. It was maintaining the secrecy of the accident. Soviet officials at the highest levels debated how much information could be released without causing panic, and without admitting to the world that Soviet nuclear technology had catastrophically failed. Mikhail Gorbachev, who was General Secretary of the Communist Party at the time, later acknowledged that Chernobyl was a turning point in his thinking about Soviet secrecy and the policy of glasnost that he would subsequently pursue. He wrote that Chernobyl demonstrated, more clearly than any political argument, the price of a system that could not acknowledge its own failures. International monitoring stations began detecting elevated radiation levels across Scandinavia within days of the explosion. It was Swedish engineers at the Forsmark nuclear power plant, detecting radiation on the clothes of their own workers, who effectively forced the Soviet Union's hand. On April 28, 2 days after the explosion, Soviet state television broadcast a 14-second announcement acknowledging that an accident had occurred. 14 seconds. For the worst nuclear disaster in human history. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, radioactive clouds were drifting across national boundaries. Fallout was detected in Sweden, Finland, Norway, Poland, Germany, Austria, France, and eventually across much of the Northern Hemisphere. Some areas of Wales and Scotland received enough fallout that restrictions on the sale of sheep meat remained in place until 2012, 26 years after the accident. The Chernobyl disaster did not respect borders. It did not stop at the edge of the Soviet Union. It became, instantly and irrevocably, a global event, being managed by a government that was simultaneously trying to pretend it had not happened. The long shadow. The health consequences of Chernobyl continue to be studied, debated, and in many cases suppressed, to this day. The most clearly documented consequence is thyroid cancer, particularly in children who were exposed to radioactive iodine-131 in the days immediately following the accident. Iodine-131 concentrates in the thyroid gland. Children's thyroids are especially vulnerable. The WHO has documented approximately 6,000 cases of thyroid cancer in individuals who were children or adolescents in the affected areas at the time of the accident. The survival rate with treatment is high, but these are 6,000 people who developed cancer as a direct result of a preventable industrial accident. 4 other cancers, leukemia, solid tumors, breast cancer, the epidemiological picture is more contested. Studies have produced a wide range of estimates. The WHO's 2005 Chernobyl Forum report estimated approximately 4,000 additional cancer deaths among the most highly exposed populations. Independent researchers, using different methodologies and broader exposure estimates, have produced figures ranging from 30,000 to over 60,000. The disagreement is not merely academic. It reflects a fundamental tension between official bodies, many of which have institutional and political interests in minimizing the perceived danger of nuclear energy, and independent researchers who argue that the full health impact of Chernobyl has been systematically understated. What is beyond dispute is that the Chernobyl disaster, its causes, its management, its cover-up, and its consequences, represents one of the most consequential industrial failures in human history. It exposed fundamental flaws not just in a reactor design, but in a political system that prioritized secrecy over safety, ideology over truth, and the appearance of control over the reality of catastrophe. It changed the global conversation about nuclear energy. It accelerated the fall of the Soviet Union. It forced a reckoning, incomplete, contested, and ongoing, with the question of what governments owe their people when the worst happens. And in the abandoned city of Pripyat, the Ferris wheel still stands. Still frozen. Still waiting for a day that never came. This has been Silent Epoch Vault, where the past speaks, and the truth refuses to stay buried. If this documentary opened your eyes, like this video, subscribe to Silent Epoch Vault, and tell us in the comments. Did you know the Soviet Union suppressed this for days? Share this with someone who needs to hear the full story.